So I do think, as Christians, sometimes we're guilty of saying, well, unjustified divorce, not a big deal. Well, pornography, not a big deal. But homosexuality, that's a terrible sin. So I think Christians have not been consistent all the time about how we approach this. Now, it doesn't follow that all sin is equal. The Bible nowhere teaches that all sin is equal. In fact, it says that Judas, who betrayed Jesus, committed the greater sin. So the Bible doesn't teach that all sin is equal. In fact, it does say in 1 Corinthians 6 that sexual immorality, which would include all sorts of immoral sexual behavior, including homosexual behavior, is a sin you commit against your own body. So it's important for us to say that all sins are not equal, and there are some sins that are worse on us, our relationship. I think they grieve God more. In fact, it says in the scriptures, these particular sins God hates. We also have to ask ourselves, are we being consistent, and are we picking certain sins we don't like for whatever reason and ignoring some in our own lives? I think as a church, we've probably been guilty of that to a degree.
A lot of Christians, even those who are on the right page on the issue of homosexual unions and transgenderism, will fall prey to the argument that all sin is equal. Now, the reason why people on the religious left want to promote the view that all sin is equal is that they will then pinpoint some sins which we regard as relatively minor. For example, gluttony, or some sins for which we have made some degree of accommodation, like divorce and remarriage. Then they'll make an analogy to those sins and say, since the church has accommodated to these offenses, why not accommodate in the issue of homosexual unions and transgenderism? And the reason why we can't do that is that all sins are not equal in all respects. All sin is forgivable, but that doesn't mean that all sin is equally serious in the eyes of God. So some sins are more serious than others. Everybody knows that. Everybody behaves that way. If your spouse comes home one night and says, honey, will you forgive me? I just really pigged out in the restaurant and I committed the sin of gluttony. I believe your spouse will forgive you immediately for having committed that sin. If you go out the next night and said, honey, you were so gracious when I talked to you about my sin of gluttony. Tonight I went out and I had sex with 4 other partners. Please forgive me like you did the night before. I don't think it's going to happen. And that's because your spouse knows that the sexual sin that you committed tonight is much more serious than the sin of gluttony you committed the night before. Everybody knows that Hitler's murder of 6 million Jews is far worse than taking home a company pen. And if you think otherwise, you're perverse ethically. Some sin is more serious than other forms of sin. In the case of homosexual practice, we're talking about a violation of an irreducible minimum of the Christian faith. The male-female requirement is the standard for all other sexual laws in Scripture. The law prohibiting in the New Testament, the moral standards prohibiting polygamy, multiple partner unions, or revolving door of divorce or remarriage for any cause, is based, according to Jesus, on a male-female requirement in Scripture, on a view of binary sexuality. There are lots of texts in Scripture which talk also directly about greater and lesser offenses. So, for example, Exodus talks about the golden calf as Israel sinning a great sin. Well, obviously, if you have a great sin, that implies there are some lesser sins. Jesus talks about weightier matters of the law. He talks about the greatest commandments. All this indicates that there are levels of degree of severity for violations of biblical norms. Jesus talks to Pilate in John 19, where he says, the one who's handed me over to you has a greater sin. So we have this all throughout Scripture. The case of incest in 1 Corinthians 5 is clearly viewed by Paul as a particularly great sin. The Corinthians are sinning lots of sins, for which we thank them. We get the whole letter of 1 Corinthians, which we otherwise wouldn't have if they didn't have so many sins. But really only at a couple of points does Paul really say, this is it. So in the case of a man having sex with his stepmother, it's required that he be put out of the community. That's a way of saying, although you have lots of sins there, this one we cannot brook, we cannot tolerate.